The morning sun cast long shadows across the military briefing room as General Marcus Thompson shuffled through his papers, preparing for what he assumed would be another routine personnel review. The year was 2003, and the war in Afghanistan was escalating rapidly. Every day brought new challenges, new casualties, and new heroes whose names would never make it into the history books. At precisely 0800 hours, the door opened and in walked Sergeant Elena Vasquez. She was smaller than Thompson had expected, standing barely 5 feet 4 inches tall with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun. Her uniform was impeccable, her posture perfect, but there was something about her quiet demeanor that immediately caught the general's attention. Unlike the other soldiers he'd met that week, she didn't carry herself with the typical bravado he'd come to expect from combat veterans. Thompson had been briefed about Vasquez before this meeting. Her file contained the usual military jargon about exceptional performance under pressure, outstanding marksmanship scores, and commendations for bravery. What had puzzled him, however, were the redacted sections and the cryptic notes from her commanding officers. There were references to specialized operations and classified assignments that even his security clearance couldn't fully access. As Vasquez took her seat across from him, Thompson noticed her hands were steady as stone. No nervous fidgeting, no anxious glances around the room. She simply sat and waited, her dark eyes focused but not challenging. It was the kind of calm that only came from someone who had seen things that would break most people. "Sergeant Vasquez," Thompson began, opening her file. "I've been reviewing your service record. Quite impressive. 3 tours in Afghanistan, numerous commendations, and exceptional scores in every evaluation." He paused, looking up at her. "Your sniper training records are particularly noteworthy." Elena nodded once, a barely perceptible acknowledgement. She wasn't one for unnecessary words, a trait that had served her well in the field where silence often meant the difference between life and death. Her childhood in rural New Mexico had taught her the value of patience and precision. Growing up on her grandfather's ranch, she'd learned to hunt at age 8, starting with rabbits and eventually moving on to deer and elk. Her grandfather, a Korean War veteran, had recognized her natural talent early and spent countless hours teaching her not just how to shoot, but how to think like a predator. "I understand you've been involved in some sensitive operations," Thompson continued, his tone becoming more serious. "I'm being considered for a new command position, and I need to understand the full capabilities of the personnel under my potential command." The room fell silent except for the distant hum of the air conditioning system. Elena studied the general's face, noting the slight tension around his eyes, the way his fingers drummed silently on the desk. She'd learned to read people quickly in her line of work. Lives depended on being able to assess threat levels, intentions, and capabilities in split seconds. Thompson was clearly fishing for information, trying to get her to volunteer details that weren't in her official file. She'd encountered this before with other officers who wanted to hear war stories, to get a sense of what real combat was like from someone who'd been in the thick of it. Most of the time, she deflected these conversations with vague responses about following orders and doing her job. "My operations have been classified, sir," she replied simply. "I've followed all protocols and completed my assignments as directed." Thompson leaned back in his chair, studying her. He'd interviewed dozens of soldiers over the years, and most of them were eager to share their accomplishments, to make sure their bravery and skill were properly recognized. Vasquez was different. There was no false modesty in her response, but also no bragging. She simply stated facts. What Thompson didn't know was that Elena's classified assignments had taken her into some of the most dangerous territories in Afghanistan. She'd spent weeks alone in the mountains, moving from position to position, tracking high-value targets that conventional forces couldn't reach. Her small stature and ability to move silently through terrain had made her invaluable for reconnaissance missions that required someone who could get close without being detected. The general decided to change tactics. "Tell me about your training, Sergeant. What makes a good sniper?" For the first time since entering the room, Elena's expression softened slightly. This was a question she could answer without revealing classified information, and it touched on something she genuinely cared about: the craft and discipline of precision shooting. "Patience, sir," she began, her voice steady but warmer.
anyone can learn to shoot accurately at a range.
But real marksmanship requires understanding weather conditions, calculating for wind drift and, bullet drop, reading terrain. Most importantly, it requires the ability to remain completely still for hours at a time, waiting for the right moment.
Thompson nodded, intrigued. And, you've mastered these skills?
I've had good teachers and plenty of practice, Elena replied. What she didn't mention was that her natural abilities had been refined through some of the most intensive training the military offered. She'd spent 6 months at the Army Marksmanship Unit, learning advanced techniques from instructors who'd served in Vietnam and the Gulf War. Her scores had been so exceptional that she'd been fast-tracked into specialized programs that most soldiers didn't even know existed. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Thompson asking carefully worded questions about her experience and Elena providing measured responses that revealed nothing sensitive. What was becoming clear to the general, however, was that Sergeant Vasquez was far from an ordinary soldier. There was a depth to her knowledge and a confidence in her abilities that suggested she'd been involved in operations well beyond what her rank might typically indicate. As the meeting drew to a close, Thompson found himself increasingly curious about what Elena's actual combat record looked like. The redacted sections of her file suddenly seemed much more significant. He made a mental note to use his contacts in intelligence to see if he could learn more about her assignments. Elena, for her part, was relieved that the interview had gone smoothly. She'd managed to answer the general's questions without revealing anything that would compromise ongoing operations or violate her security clearance. As she stood to leave, she felt the familiar weight of the secrets she carried. Her real story was one that couldn't be told in official meetings or written in standard military reports. The truth was that Sergeant Elena Vasquez had become something of a legend in certain circles of the special operations community. Her ability to eliminate targets at extreme distances while remaining completely undetected had earned her assignments typically reserved for much more senior personnel. But she'd learned early in her career that reputation could be as dangerous as enemy fire, so she'd cultivated an image of quiet competence rather than seeking recognition. As she walked down the hallway after the meeting, Elena reflected on how different her life had become from what she'd originally planned. She'd enlisted straight out of high school, initially hoping to use the military to pay for college and maybe see some of the world. She'd never imagined that her natural shooting ability and calm demeanor under pressure would lead her into the shadowy world of military special operations. The next phase of her career was already being planned by people whose names she didn't know, in meetings she'd never be invited to attend. All she knew was that her skills were in high demand, and that as long as there were threats to American forces in Afghanistan and beyond, there would be a need for someone who could eliminate those threats quietly and efficiently from a distance. Thompson watched through his office window as Elena disappeared around a corner, already planning his next move. If he was going to take on a new command position, he needed to understand exactly what assets would be available to him. Sergeant Vasquez was clearly one of those assets, and he had a feeling her true capabilities were far greater than anything indicated in her official file. 3 weeks after his initial meeting with Sergeant Vasquez, General Thompson found himself in a much different setting. The Joint Operations Command Center buzzed with activity as officers from various branches coordinated responses to multiple threats across the region. Intelligence reports were coming in faster than they could be processed, and tensions were running high. Thompson had since been confirmed for his new position as Regional Combat Commander, giving him oversight of special operations throughout the northern provinces of Afghanistan. With this new role came access to classified briefings that painted a much clearer picture of the challenges facing American forces in the region. Major Sarah Chan, his new intelligence officer, approached his desk with a thick folder marked with multiple classification stamps. She was a sharp woman in her early 30s who had earned her position through years of meticulous analysis and an uncanny ability to spot patterns in seemingly random intelligence data. "General, you need to see this," Chan said, placing the folder before him. "It's related to your inquiry about Sergeant Vasquez's operational history." Thompson opened the folder and immediately understood why so much of Elena's file had been redacted. The documents inside detailed a series of operations that read like something from a thriller novel, except these were real missions with real consequences for national security. The first report was dated 6 months earlier and described Operation Silent Thunder, a mission to eliminate a group of Taliban commanders who had been coordinating attacks on supply convoys. Traditional approaches had failed because the targets kept changing locations and had proven impossible to track using conventional surveillance methods.
Elena had been inserted alone into the mountainous region with minimal equipment and no backup.
Using only her rifle, basic survival gear, and her ability to move undetected, she had spent 3 weeks tracking the commanders through some of the most hostile terrain in Afghanistan. The mission had concluded when she eliminated 4 high-value targets in a single engagement, using precision shots from over 800 meters while remaining completely hidden. What made the operation even more remarkable was that Elena had accomplished this while evading capture by an estimated 40 enemy combatants who had been actively searching for the source of the attacks. She had managed to stay hidden, continue her mission, and extract herself without ever being detected. Thompson continued reading, his amazement growing with each page. The second operation, codenamed Phantom Strike, had taken place in an urban environment where Elena had been tasked with providing overwatch for a hostage rescue mission. The hostages were 3 aid workers who had been captured by an extremist cell operating from a fortified compound in a densely populated area. Elena had positioned herself on a rooftop nearly 600 meters from the target building and had maintained surveillance for 72 hours straight, gathering intelligence on guard rotations and defensive positions. When the rescue team moved in, she had provided cover by eliminating sentries and overwatch positions with surgical precision, allowing the team to extract the hostages without casualties. The third operation was perhaps the most impressive. Intelligence had identified a bomb-making facility hidden in a remote valley, but the location was too well defended for a conventional assault. Elena had been tasked with conducting reconnaissance and, if possible, disrupting the operation. Working alone for over 2 weeks, she had mapped the entire facility, identified key personnel, and documented their operational procedures. Rather than simply eliminating targets, she had systematically dismantled their capabilities by targeting critical equipment and materials from extreme distances. Her actions had ultimately forced the bomb makers to abandon their facility and relocate to a less secure location where they were subsequently captured by conventional forces. Major Chen watched Thompson's expression as he reviewed the files. "Sir, what you're reading represents just the operations we have documented. Sources suggest there have been others that remain classified at levels above our clearance." Thompson looked up from the documents. "Per kill count, these reports mention confirmed eliminations, but they're not specific about numbers." Chen nodded. "That's where things get interesting, sir. The exact numbers are classified, but, based on what I've been able to piece together from various sources, we're talking about a level of effectiveness that's almost unprecedented for someone of her rank and experience." What Chen couldn't tell the general was that Elena's reputation had spread beyond official military channels. In the close-knit community of special operations personnel, stories were passed along through informal networks. Elena had become something of a ghost story among enemy forces, a phantom sniper who could strike from impossible distances and disappear without a trace. The psychological impact of her operations had been significant. Enemy forces in regions where she'd been active had become increasingly paranoid and defensive, often abandoning positions and changing tactics based on rumors and fear rather than actual intelligence. This indirect effect of her work was perhaps as valuable as her direct eliminations. Thompson closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. "Major, I need to understand something. How is it that someone with this level of operational success remains a sergeant? These accomplishments suggest someone who should be at least a senior NCO, if not an officer." Chen had wondered the same thing and had done some digging. "From what I understand, sir, it's partly by choice. Sergeant Vasquez has been offered promotions multiple times, but she's turned them down. Apparently, she prefers operational assignments to administrative responsibilities. Also, her current rank allows her to maintain a lower profile, which is advantageous for the type of work she does." This explanation made sense to Thompson, but it also raised questions about Elena's motivations and long-term career goals. Most soldiers he knew were eager to advance in rank and take on leadership roles. Elena's preference for remaining in a hands-on position suggested a different set of priorities. Meanwhile, Elena herself was completely unaware that her service record was being reviewed at such high levels. She was currently on a brief leave, staying in temporary quarters on the base and trying to decompress from her recent operations. For her, the missions described in those classified reports were simply jobs that needed to be done. She didn't think of herself as exceptional or heroic, just as someone who had developed a particular set of skills and was being asked to use them. During her downtime, Elena spent most of her time in the base gym or reading in the library. She had little interest in the social activities that occupied other soldiers during their leave time. Years of operating alone had made her comfortable with solitude, and she found that too much social interaction could be mentally exhausting after the intense focus required for her missions. She had also developed a routine of writing letters to her grandfather back in New Mexico, though she could never share details about her actual work. Instead, she wrote about the landscape, the people she met in non-operational contexts, and her thoughts about life in the military. Her grandfather had been her primary influence in developing her shooting skills, and she felt he would understand her career path even without knowing the specifics. What Elena didn't know was that her next assignment was already being planned. Intelligence had identified a new threat that required exactly her unique combination of skills and psychological profile. The mission would be her most challenging yet, requiring her to operate in an environment where the margin for error was essentially zero. General Thompson was becoming increasingly interested in meeting with Elena again, but this time with full knowledge of her capabilities. He was beginning to understand that she represented a strategic asset unlike anything else under his command. The question was how to best utilize her skills while ensuring her safety and maintaining operational security. As he prepared for his next briefing, Thompson realized that Elena Vasquez was going to play a crucial role in several upcoming operations. Her ability to eliminate high-value targets while remaining completely undetected made her invaluable for missions where conventional approaches would be too risky or too visible. The irony was that Elena's greatest strength, her ability to remain invisible and unnoticed, was also what had kept her accomplishments from being widely recognized. In a military culture that often celebrated visible heroism and leadership, her quiet effectiveness had allowed her to become one of the most successful operators in the field while remaining virtually unknown outside of specialized circles. This anonymity was about to change, however, as Elena's reputation began to reach levels that would inevitably lead to greater scrutiny and more dangerous assignments. The quiet sniper who preferred to remain in the shadows was about to find herself at the center of attention from both her superiors and her enemies. The monthly command briefing was held in the largest conference room on the base, with senior officers from every branch of the military represented. General Thompson sat at the head of the table, flanked by colonels, majors, and other high-ranking personnel who were responsible for coordinating operations across the entire region. The atmosphere was tense as they reviewed recent intelligence reports and planned responses to emerging threats. Colonel James Mitchell, a gruff veteran with 30 years of experience, was presenting the latest casualty reports when the conversation turned to personnel effectiveness. Mitchell had a reputation for being skeptical of unconventional tactics and had little patience for what he considered special operations theater. "What we need," Mitchell declared, pointing to a map of recent engagement zones, "is more traditional firepower and conventional troops. These specialized units are consuming resources without delivering proportional results." Several officers nodded in agreement, but General Thompson remained silent, remembering the classified files he'd recently reviewed. He knew that many of the officers in the room had no access to information about the most sensitive operations being conducted in their area of responsibility. Major Chen, who was seated near the back of the room, caught Thompson's eye and gestured subtly toward a folder she'd placed on the table. Inside were sanitized reports about recent operations that could be discussed without revealing classified details. "Gentlemen," Thompson said, interrupting Mitchell's presentation, "I'd like to discuss the effectiveness of our current sniper programs. Major Chen has prepared some statistics that I think you'll find interesting." Chen stood and activated the presentation screen. "Over the past 6 months, our sniper teams have achieved a 98% mission success rate while maintaining 0 casualties among our personnel. The cost-effectiveness ratio is approximately 40-1 when compared to conventional operations targeting similar objectives." Lieutenant Colonel David Warner, who commanded a traditional infantry battalion, leaned forward.
Those numbers seem inflated, Major. What's the actual engagement count we're talking about here?
This was exactly the question Thompson had been expecting. The truth was that a significant portion of those statistics came from Elena's operations, but that information couldn't be shared in this forum. Chen had prepared carefully for this moment. Sir, the data includes all sniper operations across the region, including both team-based missions and individual assignments, Chen replied. The effectiveness metrics are based on verified target elimination, mission completion rates, and resource expenditure analysis.
Colonel Mitchell scoffed audibly. Individual assignments? You mean lone wolf operations? That's exactly the kind of cowboy nonsense that gets people killed.
Snipers should work in teams with proper backup and communication protocols. The room fell silent as several officers turned to look at Mitchell. His criticism wasn't entirely without merit. Lone sniper operations were inherently risky and generally discouraged except in extreme circumstances. What Mitchell didn't understand was that some situations required exactly that level of operational flexibility. General Thompson decided this was an appropriate moment to share some general information about Elena's capabilities without revealing classified details.
Colonel Mitchell, I understand your concerns about operational safety.
However, we have personnel whose skill levels and operational profiles make them suitable for assignments that would be inappropriate for typical sniper teams.
Mitchell's expression suggested he remained unconvinced.
General, with respect, I don't care how good someone thinks they are.
Combat is unpredictable, and isolated personnel are vulnerable. What happens when your lone wolf encounters a situation they can't handle? Major Chen responded before Thompson could answer.
Sir, the individual I believe the general is referencing has a perfect mission completion record with no instances of extraction being required due to enemy contact. The success rate includes missions conducted in high-risk environments where conventional approaches had previously failed. This statement created a stir around the room. Several officers began whispering among themselves, clearly skeptical of Chen's claims. The idea that any single operator could maintain a perfect record under combat conditions seemed implausible to most of them.
Lieutenant Colonel Warner spoke up again. Major, are we talking about someone currently under this command?
Because I'd like to know who this miracle sniper is.
Thompson realized the conversation was approaching sensitive territory.
While Elena's identity wasn't classified, her specific operational assignments were, and he needed to be careful not to reveal information that could compromise ongoing missions.
We do have personnel with exceptional capabilities, Thompson replied carefully.
However, for operational security reasons, I can't provide specific details about individual assignments or personnel. Colonel Mitchell leaned back in his chair with a dismissive expression.
General, this sounds like the kind of inflated reporting we saw during Vietnam.
Everyone wants to believe they have a Carlos Hathcock on their team, but the reality is usually much less impressive.
The reference to Hathcock, the legendary Marine sniper from Vietnam, was not lost on anyone in the room.
Hathcock's documented kill count of 93 confirmed kills had made him a legend in military circles, though many believed his actual number was much higher. What Colonel Mitchell didn't know was that Elena's documented statistics were already approaching Hathcock's legendary numbers, and her missions had been conducted in much more challenging environments with significantly better enemy countermeasures.
Major Chen decided to push back against Mitchell's skepticism.
Sir, I understand the comparison to historical claims, but the data I'm presenting has been verified through multiple sources. The individual in question has been observed by other personnel during joint operations, and their capabilities have been validated by independent assessment. This was technically true. Elena had worked alongside other special operations personnel on several occasions, and their reports had consistently praised her abilities.
However, Chen couldn't reveal that many of these observers had described Elena's performance in terms that seemed almost impossible.
One Navy SEAL had reported watching Elena eliminate 3 targets in rapid succession from over 900 meters while lying prone in a position that offered minimal visibility of the target area. Another Special Forces operator had described her ability to remain completely motionless for over 8 hours while maintaining constant surveillance on a target compound.
Colonel Mitchell clearly wasn't convinced. Even assuming these reports are accurate, which I doubt, What's the actual kill count we're discussing? Are we talking about a dozen confirmed eliminations? 20? Because anything beyond that stretches credibility.
The question hung in the air as everyone waited for Thompson's response. The truth was that Elena's confirmed kill count was classified at levels that prevented its disclosure in this setting, but the number was high enough that it would likely provoke disbelief from officers who hadn't seen the supporting documentation. Thompson decided to deflect rather than provide specific numbers. "Colonel, the exact statistics are classified, but I can tell you that the effectiveness levels we're discussing are unprecedented in my experience." This non-answer only seemed to increase Mitchell's skepticism. "General, with respect, that sounds like bureaucratic double-talk. If we're discussing personnel effectiveness, I need actual numbers. How many confirmed kills are we talking about?" The room tension increased as other officers began to sense the underlying disagreement between Mitchell and Thompson. What had started as a routine briefing about operational statistics was turning into a debate about the credibility of their intelligence reporting. Major Chen glanced at General Thompson, seeking permission to provide more specific information. Thompson gave a barely perceptible nod, indicating she could share some additional details without revealing classified numbers. "Sir," Chen addressed Mitchell directly, "the individual we're discussing has achieved more confirmed eliminations in 6 months than most sniper teams achieve in full deployment cycles. The exact number is classified, but it significantly exceeds typical operational expectations." Mitchell's response was immediate and dismissive. "Major, you're asking me to believe that one person, operating alone, has outperformed entire sniper teams consisting of multiple trained operators with support personnel? That's not just unlikely, it's impossible." The challenge in Mitchell's voice was clear to everyone in the room. He wasn't just questioning the statistics, he was questioning the competence and honesty of Thompson's command structure. This kind of public disagreement between senior officers was unusual and potentially damaging to unit cohesion. General Thompson realized that the situation required a decisive response. Colonel Mitchell's skepticism was undermining confidence in intelligence reporting and operational planning. The time had come to arrange a demonstration that would resolve the question once and for all. 2 days after the heated briefing, General Thompson made a decision that would change everything. He called Colonel Mitchell's bluff by arranging what he described as a demonstration of current operational capabilities. Word spread quickly through the base that something unusual was being planned, though the specific details remained classified. Elena received her orders through the usual channels, with no indication that this assignment was anything other than routine. She was instructed to report to the base firing range at 1,400 hours for what was described as a capability assessment for senior command staff. Having participated in similar demonstrations before, she assumed this would be a standard marksmanship evaluation. What Elena didn't know was that General Thompson had spent the previous day carefully orchestrating the event to maximum effect. He'd arranged for all senior officers from the contentious briefing to be present, along with several additional personnel whose expertise would lend credibility to whatever they observed. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, the base's senior marksmanship instructor, had been tasked with setting up a series of increasingly challenging scenarios. Rodriguez had worked with elite shooters for over 20 years and had initially been skeptical when Thompson described what he wanted to demonstrate. However, after reviewing Elena's training scores, he'd agreed to design a course that would push even exceptional marksmen to their limits. The firing range had been modified for the demonstration. Targets had been placed at distances ranging from 400 to 1,200 meters, with various obstacles and environmental challenges incorporated into each shooting position. Weather conditions were less than ideal, with gusty crosswinds and variable lighting that would test any shooter's ability to make accurate calculations. At precisely 1,400 hours, Elena arrived at the range carrying her standard equipment. She wore her regular combat uniform and carried the M24 sniper rifle she'd used on numerous operations. Her demeanor was calm and professional, showing no awareness that this demonstration would be anything more than routine. General Thompson and the assembled officers were positioned in the observation area, approximately 100 meters behind the firing positions. Colonel Mitchell stood with his arms crossed, his skeptical expression unchanged from 2 days earlier. He'd made it clear that he expected this demonstration to confirm his belief that the reported statistics were exaggerated. Master Sergeant Rodriguez approached Elena and handed her a briefing sheet describing the shooting scenarios. "Sergeant Vasquez, you'll be engaging targets at multiple distances under various conditions.
Take your time to review the requirements and let me know when you're ready to begin."
Elena studied the briefing sheet with the same methodical approach she brought to actual mission planning. The scenarios were challenging but within the parameters of what she'd encountered in real operations. After a few minutes, she nodded to Rodriguez and moved to the first firing position. The first target was positioned at 400 meters, which would normally be considered an easy shot for a trained sniper. However, this target was partially concealed behind cover, with only a small portion visible. Elena settled into position, adjusted her scope for distance and wind conditions, and fired a single shot. The target fell immediately. Colonel Mitchell leaned toward Thompson. "Impressive shot, General, but 400 meters isn't exactly extreme range for a qualified sniper." Thompson smiled slightly.
"Colonel, we're just getting started."
The second scenario required Elena to engage a target at 600 meters while accounting for significant crosswind. She took considerably longer to line up this shot, making minute adjustments to her scope and position. When she fired, the target went down cleanly. As the scenarios progressed, the difficulty increased dramatically. Elena was required to engage multiple targets in rapid succession, shoot from awkward positions, and compensate for environmental factors that would challenge even the most experienced marksman. Each time, her shots found their mark with precision that began to silence the skeptical murmurs from the observation area. By the seventh scenario, which required a 900-meter shot through a narrow gap between two obstacles, even Colonel Mitchell was paying closer attention. Elena had spent nearly 10 minutes preparing for this shot, calculating wind drift, bullet drop, and the optimal trajectory through the opening. When she fired, there was a long pause before the distant target fell. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who was observing through high-powered binoculars, turned to the assembled officers. "Clean hit, center mass." That shot required calculations accurate to within 2 inches at that range. The final scenario was the one General Thompson had specifically requested. A target had been placed at 1,200 meters, near the maximum effective range of Elena's rifle. The shot required her to account for multiple environmental variables and execute with precision that left no margin for error.
Elena spent almost 15 minutes preparing for this shot.
She studied wind flags placed at intervals along the range, calculated atmospheric pressure adjustments, and made fine adjustments to her position and equipment. The assembled officers watched in complete silence as she worked through her calculations. When Elena finally fired, the sound echoed across the range and everyone waited to see the result. Through the spotting scopes, they could see that the target had been hit dead center. Master Sergeant Rodriguez lowered his binoculars and turned to face the group of officers. "Gentlemen, in 20 years of instructing military marksmen, I have never seen shooting of that caliber.
Every shot was executed flawlessly under conditions that would challenge Olympic-level competitors." The observation area fell completely silent.
Colonel Mitchell's skeptical expression had been replaced by one of genuine amazement. He'd witnessed shooting that exceeded anything he'd seen during his 30-year career. General Thompson decided this was the perfect moment to address the group.
"Gentlemen, what you've just observed represents the standard of performance that Sergeant Vasquez maintains during operational assignments. The statistics we discussed in our briefing are not exaggerated. If anything, they don't fully capture the level of capability we have available." Lieutenant Colonel Warner was the first to speak.
"General, that was the most impressive marksmanship demonstration I've ever witnessed. If Sergeant Vasquez performs at that level during combat operations, then the reported effectiveness numbers are entirely credible." Other officers began expressing similar sentiments, with several asking questions about Elena's training background and operational experience.
The mood had shifted completely from skepticism to professional admiration.
Colonel Mitchell, however, remained focused on the broader implications.
"General, assuming those skills translate to combat effectiveness, what kind of operational numbers are we actually talking about? Because if someone can shoot like that under pressure, the kill count could be extraordinary. Thompson realized that Mitchell's question represented the moment he'd been building toward.
The demonstration had established Elena's capabilities beyond any reasonable doubt, which meant he could now reveal information that would have seemed impossible without that context.
Colonel Sergeant Vasquez's confirmed kill count currently stands at 164. The number hit the assembled officers like a physical blow. Several of them exchanged glances, trying to process what they'd just heard. 164 confirmed kills would make Elena one of the most successful snipers in military history, exceeding even legendary figures from previous conflicts.
Colonel Mitchell was the first to recover from the shock.
General, are you telling me that one person, a sergeant, has eliminated 164 enemy combatants while operating primarily alone? Thompson nodded gravely. Colonel, those numbers have been verified through multiple intelligence sources. Each elimination has been confirmed through battlefield observation, intelligence reporting, or direct evidence recovery. The implications began to sink in as the officers considered what this meant for their understanding of current operations. Elena hadn't just exceeded expectations, she'd redefined what was possible for a single operator working in hostile territory.
Major Chen, who had been quietly observing the reactions, added context that made the numbers even more remarkable. Sirs, it's important to note that Sergeant Vasquez achieved these results while maintaining 0 casualties among friendly forces during her operations. Her mission success rate remains at 100%. Elena, who had been cleaning her rifle and preparing to leave, was completely unaware of the conversation taking place in the observation area. She'd completed the requested demonstration and assumed that would be the end of her involvement. As she gathered her equipment, she noticed the unusual level of animated discussion among the senior officers but thought little of it. Master Sergeant Rodriguez approached her as she prepared to leave.
Sergeant, that was outstanding shooting. I'll be including a commendation in my report about today's demonstration. Elena nodded politely. Thank you, Sergeant. The range setup was excellent, very realistic scenarios. As Elena walked away from the range, the senior officers continued their discussion about the implications of what they'd witnessed.
Her calm departure, treating the extraordinary demonstration as routine, only reinforced their understanding that they'd been observing someone whose capabilities were far beyond anything they'd previously encountered. Colonel Mitchell, his skepticism completely shattered, approached General Thompson.
Sir, I owe you an apology.
I questioned the credibility of your reporting, and I was completely wrong. If we have personnel capable of that level of performance, it changes everything about how we should be planning our operations. The demonstration had achieved exactly what Thompson had hoped. Elena's abilities were now understood and accepted by the senior command staff, which would enable more effective utilization of her unique skills.
More importantly, the respect she'd earned would ensure that future recommendations regarding unconventional operations would be taken seriously.
What none of them could have predicted was how quickly word of the demonstration would spread through military networks, or how that would ultimately lead to Elena receiving attention from levels of command she'd never expected. The quiet sniper who preferred to remain invisible was about to discover that some accomplishments are too extraordinary to remain secret.